So how does ABA approach teaching? Well, there are three broad ways to look at teaching anybody, students with developmental disabilities in particular. The first is genetics. Now, if you ask me for a simple definition of who we are and what we do, I would say we are the culmination of our genetic endowment, right? Our heredity, interacting with our environment. So genetics is part of that. Genetics is important. The challenge with genetics is there are no immediate solutions in genetics, right? If a student's having a hard time learning math, you can't just go in and tinker with the math genetics and solve that problem, right? That would be genetic engineering. Sounds like science fiction. That's potentially the future. Genetics play a role, but they are not available to us to intervene on, and so we don't really pause or spend too much time on genetics as a cause of behavior. I completely understand, and I would probably want to do this myself if I was the parent of a child with autism. I know some of my clients have had genetic testing. They just want to know more information about perhaps why does my child have autism. I know a lot of families who get genetic testing, and I've seen some of the reports that come back. And I understand the motive for doing it. However, I've never taken genetic testing results and go, oh, this now gives us a solution for how to teach something. It doesn't work that way. So genetics is interesting, it plays a role, but it is not what we intervene on, so we're not going to worry about that. The next way of looking at how we approach teaching is thinking about the past. Now, the past absolutely influences what we do. If you think about our behaviors are selected by consequences, the consequences have occurred in the past, right? What we do today is a function of the consequences we encountered leading up to today throughout our lifetimes. So the past is important, but the past doesn't explain necessarily the learning or lack of learning behavior in the classroom today. It's related, but not the most immediate thing. Right? I'll sometimes hear be talking about, in particular, around challenging problem behavior, and somebody will say, oh yeah, well, 2 years ago in December, he would throw TVs and hit people. Like, okay, well, that was 2 years ago in December. How is that impacting today? It's probably not that relevant, right? What is most relevant is the here and the now. It's the environment that you're in. It is the classroom that you're in. It is the instruction that the student is in the presence of. We are concerned about what we can manipulate and alter and control in terms of instruction, and that is the present environment. So as much as genetics in the past may be interesting and certainly relevant to some degree, it is not what teachers can intervene on. We can only intervene on the here and now. And so as a behavior analyst, I'm very much interested in the current context. Behavior is contextual, right? Behavior occurs in context. And this is very relevant to the IEP because one of the jobs of an objective in the IEP is to specify the context in which place or under which circumstances behavior will occur, the new behavior, the learning will occur, right? So this is very congruent with teaching. So when we have the current environment, if that's where our focus is, this brings us to this ABC analysis. I know most of you are familiar with that. It's looking at the behavior bookended by the immediate antecedents and the immediate consequences. Keeping in mind there is a role of delayed consequences in history outside of the immediate environment, but we can only control the immediate environment. So antecedent, if you prefer trigger, occurs right before the behavior, and that can be something like an instruction, like, hey class, sit down. That's an antecedent. And then the behavior is following the antecedent, doing what the antecedent asks. It's the verb, it's the action that the student engages in. And then there's a consequence, and remember I said that we are the science of consequences, and teaching is the science of consequences, where if you provide the right consequences, the desired behaviors will go up, and that will be pro-social learning, or you can have the opposite of that. So let me take you through, I recognize we're coming up pretty quickly on our first break, and I'm a little bit behind. Some examples of ABCs across the natural environment. Because a lot of people go, oh, ABCs, that's where you take a child, you sit at a table in an isolated room, and you do discrete trial ABC instruction. Well, sometimes yes, but ABCs aren't limited to that kind of artificial analog environment. They occur in the natural flow of behavior. So for example, in a preschool class, the teacher might say, point to the tree. And the student looks and scans and then points to the tree. And the teacher says, great job, that is a tree. And notice what season it is. And you'll notice that this occurs in the natural flow of conversation. It's not just this artificial interaction. That the natural interactions are just series of these ABC interactions. The teacher asks something, the student responds, there's a consequence, we move on to the next thing. Right? ABCs occur in real time. In kindergarten, the teacher says, which season follows winter? That's the antecedent, the trigger. And the student says, springtime. Yeah, you got it. And what do you like about springtime? Again, it occurs in kind of conversational language, everyday flow. It's not this artificial thing. And when you can appreciate that, you can go into any instructional setting and recognize, oh, all teaching is really just a matter of arranging ABCs. This is a grade 6 example that resonates from my daughter's grade 6 here. The teacher says, who completed their ancient civilizations projects last night? That's an antecedent delivered to the whole class, and 28 hands go up, and the teacher says, well done, class, right? There's some reinforcement to consecrate the kids who did it. Those of you who didn't raise your hands, see me at recess. There's some differentiated consequences there. Here's a student with autism in grade 12. The special education teacher says, what will you do if you miss your bus stop on the way to work experience? That's an antecedent, that's a question, a trigger. And the student says, I'll get off at the next stop and I'll walk back. And the teacher says, yes, exactly, good job, and also text your boss on the way back. Good problem solving, right? This occurs in the context of conversation and the natural flow, but it's still ABC interactions. This goes on. Here's the university. This is with my class. The professor, I ask, what are the two effects of motivating operations? And the student responds, value-altering and behavior-altering effects, professor. And I say, excellent, and then I move on to the next thing, right? So ABCs are from preschool to university and throughout the natural course of interactions. So how does this benefit you as the teacher, for those of you who are the educators in the audience? This allows you to examine antecedents and consequences to determine what's going on and why, right? If I can look at the student's behavior and put it in the context of, okay, what are the antecedents in the classroom? What are the consequences? I can start to figure out why things are or are not happening. And then that is the power of teaching. This is a message of optimism and power because we control the antecedents and the consequences, right? If we change as teachers, as educators, as parents, what we do before behavior and after behavior, that results in teaching and learning. That is the teaching and learning interaction, right? Our students just don't behave or acquire skills or not acquire skills in a vacuum. Everything is in the context of the environment, and we are the environment. The classroom is the environment. Teaching is the environment. So this is a message of power and optimism. Another way to conceptualize this, add some color to it, antecedent behavior consequence. If we look at the antecedent column, this is the instruction arranged by the teacher. It's what the teacher does. It's the teacher's action verb. And we call that teaching. And then we see the student's learning behavior, right? The behavior is the student's response to the instructional arrangement, to how the teacher arranges the environment or delivers a vocal or oral instruction. That's what the student does. That's the student's action or verb, and we call that learning. And then to close this learning loop, we need to have consequences, which is programmed consequences, programmed reinforcers to capture the desired behaviors, right? The target for teaching and learning to be strengthened and to continue and to be part of the repertoire. So we can move on to building that repertoire. And delivering consequences is an action and a verb, and that's also teaching. So the actions of the teacher are to arrange the environment and deliver antecedents and structure antecedents, and to deliver the consequences so that I can capture responding. That's what my student does. Let me just get through a couple more things here before we hit our first break. So you can think of this as ABC interactions. You can call it a learning loop. I know one of our previous presenters was Dr. Stephanie Joel with Canucks Autism Network, and I know that she, as part of her doctoral dissertation, taught swim instructors to be more effective swim instructors for kids with autism by teaching them some of these tactics. And she essentially described ABCs to the swim instructors, but she called them learning loops, which just really appeals, right? It has intuitive sense, and you can see how this is ABC, a loop. Another way to conceptualize it is to call it the learn unit. So a learn unit was a term coined by Dr. Douglas Greer at Teachers College at Columbia University. And the learn unit is an ABC interaction, and he really likes to describe it as this interactive dance between what this teacher does, how the student responds, and how the teacher correctly or incorrectly consequates that, and that both parties here are critical in the interaction in the learn unit. Here's one of the big takeaway points. I've added a little visual support there. You see that take-home green box there? You'll see those kind of scattered throughout my presentation. That's a cue that there's a big idea here. The presence and number of correctly delivered learn units is the strongest predictor of effective teaching. Said another way, the number of response opportunities is the greatest predictor of learning. Right? If you want to know how do you teach something effectively, present a lot of opportunity to learn it. A lot of opportunity where you present antecedents, the student is able to engage in their correct behavior under the right circumstances, contact some type of reinforcement, at least intermittently. If you do that a lot, that will predict greater learning outcomes than if you have fewer learning opportunities. That just makes sense. If you want to become good at something, you're going to do it a lot, right? So that's the presence of a high number of learn units. And correctly delivered means that the teacher has to have, whether you're the teacher, the special educator, the education assistant, or a parent, when you are teaching a person, you need to make sure that you're correctly delivering antecedents and correctly consequating, because what you do influences the student's learning, right? We can't remove ourselves from teaching and learning. We can't just talk about learning. Learning occurs in the context of teaching, and we are the teachers. So here's an example of that. Here's a correct learn unit. The teacher has a group of students, just picture this, and the teacher recognizes class is about to end. There's 3 or 4 minutes before class ends. The teacher gives some type of cue, ensures that everyone quiets and looks, eyes on me or something like that. I've got all of your attention, and now that I've got your attention, I've essentially managed antecedents and I've stacked them in the deck towards my favor. Then the teacher says, how many of you have finished questions 1 through 9 in chapter 4 of the math textbook that we reviewed last Tuesday? You'll notice that she secured their attention, she delivered a very clear, unambiguous instruction, and all of their hands go up. And the teacher goes, I'm so blessed to have such a great group of kids this year, right? Well, yeah, great, the students are doing what you want them to do, but you have a lot of responsibility for that because you enabled that success by delivering clear instructions, by having good antecedents as part of that learn unit. Here's a non-example to contrast that. It's not 3 or 4 minutes before the end of class. The bell has gone. The kids are up. They're moving. They're talking. They're checking their phones. Half the kids are up the classroom. And the teacher yells out, oh my goodness, I almost forgot. How many of you have finished that thing that we talked about? You know, that thing from a while back? And like there's the 2 kids in class who could be teaching the class. They've got it. Their hands go up. And everyone else is either gone or not paying attention or just avoiding eye contact. And the teacher goes, oh, this group that I've got, right? That's blaming the student, where really if you analyze the antecedent probably could have been better. And if you'd structured the antecedent, you'd have a different learning response, right? So it is this tango, this dance between what the teacher does and how the student responds, which places a huge amount of emphasis on what the teacher does. And that's a big part of the message that I'll keep coming back to. So behavior analysts and teachers have more in common than you think, which is why I love going in and working in schools and collaborating with teachers, because our jobs are fundamentally the same. So a definition of ABA is applied behavior analysis is the process of systematically applying interventions based upon the principles of learning theory to improve socially significant behaviors to a meaningful degree and to demonstrate that the interventions employed are responsible for the improvement in behavior. So we do interventions. We want to make sure it's the interventions that are working and that they benefit the individual. If you look at a definition of teaching, recognizing that there are many definitions of teaching, teaching is the process of attending to people's needs, experiences, and feelings, and making specific interventions to help them learn particular things. So the core fundamentals are the same there, right? So we are on the same team as the punchline here. Both behaviorally inclined educators, behavior analysts, and teachers of any stripe, we use interventions. We all use interventions, or tactics. And we have student outcomes, which is the student learning. That's what we're after. So the goal for me as a behavior analyst and for you as a teacher and for you as a parent, it's all the same thing, right? So we're really much all in the same team. But wait, don't you just do discrete trial teaching or just address problem behavior? Get that a lot, right? People think of ABA as just an autism program where you sit a child down at a table, and it can include that, certainly. And there's some research to show that's a very effective way of teaching some things to some kids some of the time, but not all of the time. Or people go, oh, you're the problem behavior guy, right? Well, sometimes I'm the problem behavior guy, but more often than not, I'm the instructional design teaching guy. So what else do we do? Well, we do motivation, reinforcement. Applications of reinforcement would include things like token systems, right? When I teach students about applied behavior analysis, we have a whole class, a whole week, and chapters and readings on motivation, and certainly a lot of content on reinforcement. We shape behaviors. Shaping is taking the kind of precursor of something and morphing it to an outcome, the terminal objective that is in the best interest of the individual. Chaining is really important. Behavioral chains are complicated bits and pieces you put together to achieve an outcome, like you getting up and getting dressed in the morning, and me arriving here on time, right, groomed and hygienic and ready to go, is a number of chains that had to occur. And task analysis is taking sophisticated chains and breaking them down, because some of our students have a hard time putting chains together, like completing an activity, grooming, tying their shoes, and things like that. Those are behavior chains. We can break it down. We can teach that. Modeling and imitation are important areas in ABA programming. In particular, we recognize that imitation is really critical for the development of students with autism. And the point of imitation is that not that you can just copy me and do this. It's that it it kind of blossoms into the larger repertoire where if you're in the environment, if you're out there in the world and you don't know what to do, you can look around and see what everybody else is doing. We call that observational learning. We work on imitation with the goal of achieving observational learning because that is a critical life skill, right? Think of how many times you might have been in a new circumstance, on vacation, you're not sure what to do, and so you just observe what other people are doing and you imitate, and it works out well for you. We do some discrete trial teaching for sure, right? That's an intensive, often table-based instruction. And really, that is simply an instructional technique. It doesn't define a field or a practice. And as I said a few moments ago, this can be the single most effective and efficient way to teach some things in a controlled setting, but it is not the purpose, it's not the goal to do this for all things all of the time. We teach requesting and labeling and answering questions. As I mentioned earlier, the overlap of scope of practice between behavioral education and speech-language pathology. We work on rate building. I know some of my colleagues in the precision teaching world are going, thankfully he mentioned rate building and fluency instruction. This is basically teaching people to be fast, because once you know how to do something, once you've acquired the basic skills, an expert is someone who does it quickly and really thoughtlessly and with automaticity. I always think about like the NHL skills competition, if you've ever watched that, where they've got these high-level NHL hockey players who come in and they will do like speed shooting and they have to hit targets. And it's not just that they're accurate, but they also have to be really fast. An expert is somebody who's accurate and fast. There's the problem behavior. Certainly we do functional behavior assessment and positive behavior support and other types of behavioral interventions to address challenging or problem behavior. Antecedent interventions are to prevent problems in the first place. And as I've mentioned a few times, generalization and maintenance, because the only lesson worth teaching is a lesson that lasts into the future and generalizes to other settings and can be applied. We also do natural environment teaching, so teaching in any environment, the classroom, the hallway, the community center, at home. Picture exchange communication system originated through the collaboration of Dr. Andy Bondi, who's a behavior analyst, and his wife, Laurie Frost, who's a speech-language pathologist. And so PECS is really the marriage, quite literally, of applied behavior analysis and speech-language pathology, although the instruction of PECS is entirely behavior analytic. We do a lot of work with peers where possible, right? So it's not all that, it isn't just that adults have to teach students with special needs or autism, but if we can harness the power of peers and peer-mediated interventions, there's a robust literature base on that. We do activity schedules and visual supports, right? We all have visual supports. If you have the handout in front of you, that's a visual support. My calendar is a visual support. Visual supports are normative, and we use those quite extensively. And then other things, moving beyond just elementary school, as I've kind of alluded to. I've taught lots of, I can't say kids, I've taught young people and adults how to take the bus and how to go shopping and how to cook and clean and get a job and keep a job and go to an interview and get to work on time and do your job and become a taxpayer. Real work for real pay is what we're looking for. And there's also sexual health and safety and many other things, right? So applied behavior analysis has a huge scope of practice. We can teach, and we have the technology of teaching and the science behind it, a large range of things. And this is kind of, why am I sharing this with you? Kind of as an FYI, if you're wondering, well, how do you utilize your friendly neighborhood behavior analyst? We thought we could just talk to that person for problem behavior. Well, now you know that you can talk about many more things.